South Korea is at a critical point in history. Will it continue to be a U.S. ally, or will it turn to China? Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. What I'm talking about is something neither China nor South Korea once discussed. Earlier this week, Donald Trump met with recently elected South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, who offered Trump a lot of flattery. He told Trump that the American president is bringing peace to the world and that he hopes Trump can also bring peace to the Korean peninsula. And he also said he looks forward to seeing a Trump Tower in North Korea. Wow, what a concept. I wonder if he'll have a golf course so Kim Jong-un can score 11 holes in one, just like his dad. Totally, 100%, no lying, did. Clearly, Lee knows how to get on Trump's good side, or at least he thinks he knows, but Trump had better keep his head on swivel, because South Korea's leadership is heavily infiltrated by pro-CCP leftists who are no friends to the United States, and Lee is one of them. Which is one reason there are currently tons of protests against him and the CCP. You know, as stressful as all the civil unrest around the world is, on the bright side, all these protests mean everyone's getting their steps in. Yay, fitness goals. I'll come back to that later. The protests, not the fitness goals. But first, let me talk a little bit about Lee. Lee has a long history of promoting things that China likes. Unlike his predecessor, Yoon Suk-yeol, who affirmed Taiwan support, Lee asked what a cross-strait issue between China and Taiwan has to do with Korea. Earlier this year, Lee invited Chinese leader Xi Jinping to the APEC summit and offered visa-free entry to Chinese tourists. And while meeting with Trump, Lee also sent a special envoy to meet Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and tell him that South Korea wants to normalize ties and upgrade economic relations. Which sounds a lot like Lee's way of saying to Xi, I have to meet with Trump, but don't worry, you're my true bae. Meanwhile, Lee has made it clear that he's not a big fan of the U.S. He called the U.S. an occupation force, and back in 2017 spoke out against the U.S. deployment of THAAD anti-missile systems in Korea, while promising that if he became president, he would withdraw THAAD. Because nothing says the U.S. is an occupation force like a defensive military system. Lee also praised communist Vietnam for fighting off foreign powers, which includes both American and South Korean forces. It's not just Lee either. Lee's government is full of officials who are none too fond of America. I'm about to go in deep, but if you like this kind of deep dive into what's really going on in China, you've got to subscribe to my premium website, ChinaUncensored.tv. That's where you'll see episodes and live streams we can't put on YouTube. And if you want to support China Uncensored, buying a membership is the best way you can. It's just the price of a bag of coffee. Once again, that's ChinaUncensored.tv. So, the current South Korean government is full of leftists, including Prime Minister Kim Min-seok, who protested against the U.S. as a university student. Ironically, he'd really get along with modern U.S. university students. And then there's the head of Lee's Democratic Party of Korea, Jung Chong-rae, who led the 1989 occupation of the U.S. ambassador's residence in Seoul, allegedly with bombs, though Jung denies it. That's not to mention the way Lee has cozied up to North Korea. Lee is one of those Korean leftists who pursues dialogue, communication, and coexistence with the Hermit Kingdom, which apparently means respecting North Korea's political system and holding back on military drills with the U.S. to appease North Korea. Lee was also indicted on bribery charges after he was accused of illegally transferring $8 million to North Korea between 2019 and 2020 when he was serving as governor of Gyeonggi province. So how did Lee, the CCP stooge, become president of South Korea? Well, last year, former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law in South Korea. He argued that the opposition Democratic Party of Korea was holding a legislative dictatorship and citing 22 impeachment attempts since he took office in May 2022, as well as pro-North Korea and anti-state forces. But in general, no one in South Korea really liked what Yoon did. There were mass protests and calls for him to be impeached. Again, ultimately earlier this year, Yoon was removed from office and an emergency election was held, and Lee won. Now, there are some legitimate questions about how exactly Lee won. If you want more information on that, then I highly recommend you watch this podcast we did with one of the members of the U.S. election monitoring delegation sent to oversee the South Korean presidential election. It's not very YouTube-friendly since YouTube doesn't like it when we talk about elections that might not be very secure, so I'll leave a link below. But regardless of how Lee came to power, he wasted no time consolidating it. His first order of business? Cracking down hard on his opponents in the name of countering martial law-related corruption. Lee's government has put Yoon in solitary confinement with just a makeshift cardboard platform to sit on. South Korean authorities also had his wife arrested on corruption charges and have his prime minister in their sights. Police are also reportedly investigating South Korean citizens who went to Incheon International Airport in July to welcome former U.S. Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice Morris Tan, a strong proponent of South Korean election integrity. Which totally shouts we're innocent of any kind of election shenanigans. There are even reports of a special prosecutor created by the Lee Jae-myung administration requesting the personal information of 5 million People Power Party members. That's Yoon's party, by the way. There have also been a ton of raids targeting Yoon's People's Power Party headquarters. The Liberty and Innovation Party, whose founder has joined Yoon's defense team, and the Unification Church, as well as a former People Power Party floor leader's office. As a side note, the Unification Church is a cult that many know as the Moonies, whose founders claim to be the Messiah and Holy Spirit. So calling it a church might be stretching the meaning of that just a tad. But there was even reportedly a raid on the U.S. South Korea Osan Air Base without notification to the U.S. military. And this is where Trump comes in. Just hours before his meeting with Lee, Trump posted on Truth Social, "What is going on in South Korea? Seems like a purge or revolution. We can't have that and do business there." He doesn't want to do business in a place that's completely volatile and run by maniacs? If only the rest of the world felt the same way about China. He also made these comments.
Well, I heard that there were raids on churches over the last few days, very vicious raids on churches by the new government in South Korea, that they even went into our military base and got information. They probably shouldn't have done that, but I heard bad things. I don't know if it's true or not. I'll be finding out.
Trump mentioned the church raid during the pre-meeting press conference with Lee after a press member asked about it, although he left it for discussion later, saying it was probably a misunderstanding. But you know who doesn't think Lee's actions are a misunderstanding? The Korean people. There have been tons of protests, with many even calling for Lee's arrest and calling the election fake, which, as far as the mainstream media outlets are concerned, is an unfounded conspiracy theory. But whether or not China interfered in the South Korean election earlier this year, the CCP absolutely stands to gain a ton from a friendly government in South Korea. The people know this, and that's why the protests aren't just about South Korea, they're also about China. Here you can see Koreans tearing apart the Chinese flag, as well as a picture of Wang Huning, chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and good old Xi Jinping himself. Many of the protesters are unabashedly anti-China. People in the streets protesting China. You know, sometimes it feels like I'm screaming into the void. It's nice to see others are screaming into the void with me, but the protesters aren't just anti-China. They're also pro-US, and more specifically, Trump.
Make Korea! Make America!
That's something I never thought I'd hear. Chinese officials have responded by urging South Korea to crack down on anti-China voices, which media outlets keep labeling as far-right. If by right they mean correct, then I agree. They are, by far, right. And the Lee administration has been more than willing to oblige. Authorities started investigating the quote-unquote right-wing group that allegedly tore the Chinese national flag near the Chinese embassy. And Li himself ordered measures to curb what he called hatred and discrimination, referring specifically to quote-unquote hateful demonstrations in front of Chinese diplomatic offices where the insulting language and violence exceeded the bounds of freedom of expression. So he's cracking down on rights violations by violating their rights. Same way he's cracking down on corruption through corrupt means. Hopefully this guy never has to treat a stab wound. China's ambassador commended Li for addressing anti-China protests. The US and South Korea have been allies for a while, but that doesn't mean that relationship couldn't disappear in an instant if leftists take over the government. After all, something similar happened in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez took charge. But when dealing with people who decide to simp for communists, this level of stupid is just par for the course, where their leaders claim to have made 11 holes in one. And click here to listen to the full podcast we did with the guy who witnessed firsthand how Korea's election went down. It's not a pretty picture, but we can't talk about it here on YouTube. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.